Good morning, everybody. What I would like to speak about today is really some ideas about how radical longevity could get more into the mainstream of modern political thinking. And actually, so today, rather than using slides and bullet points like I would often do, I'd like to speak more broadly about some of the experiences that we've had with emerging technologies within the political ecosystem. And first off then, a little about my experience in this area. So I started out in my 20s and I set up a technology company and I hired a manager after a few years. So effectively I was able to semi-retire and focus on things that interest me. And so for the last 10 years, as Neil said, I've been running a think tank founded by a member of parliament in the UK. And I've served on the boards of some others in Europe and worked with other think tanks elsewhere, including here in the US. And really threading through a lot of the work that I've done, I put an emphasis on emerging technologies. For me, really, I think emerging technologies are the most important aspect of modern political policy making. I think artificial intelligence, biotechnology, also blockchain, and of course radical longevity. I think these are far more important areas of policy making than most of the political stuff that politicians discuss and that have been discussing for generations. And as part of that then, we've had the opportunity to work on some quite interesting projects over the years and some quite high level projects as well. So for instance, we organized the artificial intelligence roundtable discussions in the European Parliament as part of a series of events on AI. And we also organized the blockchain summit in the European Parliament as well. And I think there's some things that we learned from this, from getting these ideas of emerging technologies into the political ecosystem, that'll be useful to think about for radical longevity, actually. So in particular, the blockchain summit, which we organized, that was in early 2016. And so at the time, Bitcoin, blockchain, crypto was really just on the fringes of political discourse. In fact, many politicians on both sides of the Atlantic were talking about banning Bitcoin in those days. The idea of the BlackRock ETF and so on was not even on the horizon. So when we organized it in the European Parliament, we had a whole day of roundtable discussions on blockchain. We had the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, all of these types of global institutions. So it really gave us the opportunity to make a positive case for this technology and what it can achieve. And actually, we did all of these events as well without any corporate funding, which turned out to be very useful because we could really focus purely on the policy aspects, and let's say without any accusations of bias or anything like that. Because as I said, I regard policy making with respect to emerging technologies as really the most important issues of our day politically, far more than the everyday political issues. So if we turn for a moment then to the political situation with respect to radical longevity, there have been some positive developments in recent years. So for instance, in March of 2022, ARPA-H was conceived. And so ARPA-H is a government agency here in the US, which is focused on really quite far out developments for healthcare and longevity. And ARPA-H is actually modeled on DARPA, which for those of you who aren't familiar with DARPA, that is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And for the last few decades, they've been tasked with really high risk, high reward areas of technology for the defense sector. So for instance, some of the things that have come out of DARPA over the years include the internet and GPS, even to a large extent, self-driving cars, actually. So to have something like this for longevity, I think is a very positive development. But it's also worth bearing in mind the total funding for ARPA-H is around $2.5 billion. And now that may sound like a lot of money, but to put it into perspective, the US sugar program, for instance, which is a kind of network of price floors and import quotas to protect the US sugar industry. The total cost for that has been estimated by economists to be around $4 billion. So this $2.5 billion for ARPA-H, it's a fantastic step to have ARPA-H, but we really need to do all we can to ensure that that funding is boosted. Because again, something like DARPA for longevity would be a huge step forward. But then there have been some other positive developments as well. Also in 2022, in January, the World Health Organization, its ICD-11 came to fruition. That's the International Classification of Diseases. And they did actually create a classification for age-related diseases. And they also, it was, I forget the exact classification now, but there was another classification as well, just purely for aging. And in the years following that, it was in fact modified slightly. But nevertheless, this is also a significant step forward. It may sound somewhat bureaucratic to have all of these classifications and things, but actually it is an important step because, for instance, when it comes to researchers around the world coordinating their efforts, these types of classifications are important to treat aging as something that can be prevented. But also, additionally, when it comes to health insurance as well, to have these types of classification can be very useful. But I want to turn for a moment then specifically to think tanks, actually, because that, obviously, in most developed countries, that is where a lot of policy comes from these days. And, for instance, in Washington, D.C. alone, there are more than 400 think tanks focusing on everything from defense and security to financial inclusion, really you name it. And if you're going to characterize what think tanks do, for instance, if I was to relate it to startups, which is where I came from originally, you could say that the products that a think tank produces are ideas and policies. And if those ideas and policies are better suited to the marketplace, then those think tanks will tend to thrive over time, just like a business. But also additionally, at the moment increasingly, think tanks will even take care of, let's say, the complete product cycle as such, if you could put it like that, right through to drafting legislation. So I think one of the things that could be useful for the radical longevity movement is engaging more with some of the more established think tanks in Washington, D.C., also in London and Brussels and elsewhere. But just on that then, on this, let's say that the mood of the whole policy-making ecosystem at the moment, I think a barrier that we do have is actually the amount of general pessimism among policymakers at the moment. I'm sure most of you here today, like me, are technological optimists. We live really in an extraordinary period of human history. We are on the verge of these developments in technology, which we've been hearing about for the last couple of days, which are going to transform everything. In fact, if you just consider it for a moment, just the statistical probability of being born in this day and age, we are just extraordinarily lucky. You could have been born at any time in human history. You could have been born as a slave in ancient Egypt, and that would have been your life, or a serf in medieval Russia. But no, you're here today in California at this exact point in history where we are on the verge of these extraordinary developments. Just to think about it is amazing. But nevertheless, just to think about the flip side of that coin then, because I do think the general pessimism at the moment is a wall which we're going to need to break down. I think to look at this pessimism in policy making, if you consider millennials for a moment then, so that's the generation that I'm a part of, there's a lot of evidence now that millennials will be the first generation, since before the Industrial Revolution, that'll be poorer than their parents. And you could even arguably go back further than that, maybe even to the scientific revolution of the 1600s. So it's quite an extraordinary development, actually, that we have this secular deterioration in living standards from one generation to the next, arguably for the first time in hundreds of years, possibly even getting off a half a millennium. And this has actually also fed through to some other areas like life expectancy, which has been quite stagnant in recent years and is arguably even in decline for the last few years in the US and a number of other countries as well. So I think this has served as a bedrock for this general attitude of pessimism at the moment. And so to start to push ideas of radical longevity into this ecosystem of policymaking, that really is like a wall of pessimism that needs to be knocked down. But nevertheless, there are some, I do think it is still an opportune time for pushing these ideas for a number of reasons, but a couple of reasons in particular. First of all, I think the recent developments in the consumer-facing AI have been extraordinary. As Neil mentioned, one of the events that we did was the artificial intelligence roundtable discussions in the European Parliament. So we organized those and I moderated those. And it was very interesting. That was in early 2019. So really just around 5.5 years ago. And we had a lot of experts speaking. We had professors, we had people from the IMF and the OECD and companies like Intel. And I would make the case in those days that we were likely within, let's say, 10 to 15 years of artificial intelligence reaching human-level intelligence. But many people would say, no. I mean, if it happens, it'll happen in 100 years or maybe even 150 years or something. But I think more and more people realize now that we are within a few years of artificial general intelligence. Of course, it's very difficult to predict more precisely. But I think that has now become part of the general consciousness now, that we are close to this. So that, I think, makes it far easier to push some of the fundamental ideas of radical longevity more into the mainstream. So ideas like longevity escape velocity, for instance, which even just a few years ago, many people would have considered a little fanciful. But again, with the recent developments, people are a lot more open-minded to these concepts. Additionally, as well as the developments in AI, I think also another point is people's minds are opening up more to a lot of different ideas. So actually another event that we did recently this summer in Westminster in London, we worked with one of the political think tanks in Westminster, and we organized an event on psychedelics. And again, so psychedelics is one of these ideas which for decades has been on the fringes of political discourse. And more recently, people have come to start to think about it a bit more seriously. And so for this event that we did in Westminster, of course there's been other events on psychedelics in London and elsewhere, but this was the first time this had been done in one of the main political think tanks that's constantly advising political figures and so on. And I wasn't really sure how it was going to go. I was on a panel with a professor and a couple of experts as well, and but the feedback was really very good. So afterwards, a lot of people were coming up to me wanting to learn more. I had a lot of people connecting up with me on social media afterwards. So again, this idea that has really been on the fringes for decades, now I think people's minds are opening up to a lot of these new things. So as well as the fundamentals of the advancements in AI and other emerging technologies, I think that also helps to make this an opportune time for pushing ideas of radical longevity into the political mainstream. So given that, then, what I also wanted to do was talk through a couple of specific areas, or a couple of specific methods, actually, which could be useful for this. And the first one is book publishing. And so, but a specific kind of book that I have in mind, actually. So we've been working with Springer Nature recently, and actually we published 3 books in the last 2 years with Springer Nature. And for those of you who aren't familiar with academic publishing, in essence, it's very hierarchical and elitist, similar to universities, where the elite universities get the lion's share of all research funding. If you can publish a book with one of the elite academic publishers, it automatically goes out to most universities around the world to be used for teaching. And so we did a book on central banking and a book on free trade, but one that we're working on at the moment to be published next year, I think would be actually very useful as a template for something that we could do on radical longevity. And that is a book that we're doing on artificial intelligence. Except for this book on AI, rather than doing what is normally done with academic publishers, that is having a book written by professors, we're actually inviting some of the top people around the world in the most important areas of AI to each write chapters. So, for instance, we have some senior political figures from different countries that have been involved in some of the recent AI discussions at a global political level. On the section on defense and security, we have a former defense minister and a former chief of the defense staff, so that's the head of the UK military. And we've also got think tanks like the RAND Corporation and the OECD. And so as I was flying over here, we were working on this, and I was really thinking something like this could work very well for radical longevity. If we think about the books on longevity at the moment, they often fall into one of two camps. You have the Amazon bestsellers, which are fantastic, and of course I read them, I recommend them to friends and buy them for family members. And then the books published through the elite academic publishers often tend to be at a high level, so written by scientists for scientists. But with this AI book, what we're doing is this is not aimed at just AI practitioners. This is for teaching to economic students, international relations students, business students, whatever it may be. The idea is that we can produce a definitive book on AI policy with the best experts from all of these different fields. So I think something like that for radical longevity could work extraordinarily well. So again, not just looking at the scientific aspects, but also having sections on the economics of radical longevity. What does it mean for insurance companies when we do reach longevity escape velocity, for instance? But additionally, there's the other aspects like inequality, for instance. So as life extension technologies do become available, we would hope that they would become more widely available, not just to the extremely wealthy. So issues like these could be discussed in a book like this. And again, if we could find one of the elite academic publishers to work with, that would then go out to universities around the world to be used for teaching. So not just to medical students, but economic students, sociology students, and so on. So that's one area which we've been working on, which I think would serve well for radical longevity. But another actually is, you could say it's at the other end of things from elite academic publishing, and that is using things like animations and infographics, which as Jose mentioned, when he ran to become member of the European Parliament, I worked with him on some of this actually. And I know a lot of companies and institutions use things like animations, but we've actually used them in some quite interesting ways. In particular, for AI, we received some funding from the Journal of Artificial Intelligence. So that's the oldest and most prestigious journal in AI, to produce some animations that would explain some of the key concepts of AI for political policymakers. And so we did a series of animations with this funding from the Journal of AI. And so I'll show you a 2-minute clip in a moment for the kind of things that we've been working on. So some of them actually, we took these types of events that we've been doing in the political world, like in the European Parliament on AI, and we took some of the speeches from the IMF and so on, and like overlaid animations to explain things like the future work. And so again, I think something like this for radical longevity could be useful, because the video I'll show in a second explains the concept of Moore's law, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Jose explained it very well just now. the growth and the power of computation. But again, many people in the political policy-making world are simply not familiar with it, even though it's so fundamental to the world that we live in. So something like this also for ideas like longevity escape velocity, for instance. I mean, if you were to take 100 people in the world of political policy-making in Washington or London or Brussels or wherever else, what percentage of them do you think would have heard of longevity escape velocity? Maybe 4, maybe 3, could it be 1 or 0 perhaps, I'm not even sure. But at the moment, I think it's quite low, even though it's absolutely such a fundamental concept to the world that we're living in. Again, like Moore's law, it's one of the most important concepts that political policymakers should understand. So that's where we found these types of animations very useful. And again, we did these with funding from the Journal of Artificial Intelligence. So if it can be done working with, for instance, some of the top journals to explain these highfalutin science concepts to a more general audience, I think that can be very useful.
The Compton Center is producing materials to explain artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies for global policymakers. These animations are mainly taken from events we have organized in the European Parliament, including the Future of Artificial Intelligence roundtable discussions with speakers from the United Nations, IMF, OECD, the head of privacy at Intel, consumer rights groups, and AI startups.
So first of all, then, conceptualizing the economics of AI. There have been some brilliant thinkers in this area over the last few decades, but actually most of them have not been economists. Most of them have been AI practitioners. And several of them have a lot to offer to help us think through these issues. One of them is Ray Kurzweil, who is now a director of engineering at Google. And actually, my father set up and ran a software company for 25 years, and when I was a teenager, he would be constantly encouraging me to read the books of Ray Kurzweil, who would predict how AI was going to develop by looking at the processing powers in computers doubling consistently. It's what's known conventionally as Moore's law. Gordon Moore was the CEO of Intel, and he wrote a paper showing that the number of transistors that would fit on an integrated circuit was doubling every 2 years or so. But more concretely for us, what that means is essentially computers become twice as powerful roughly every 18 months to 2 years. And that's been going on for decades. That's why the smartphone in your pocket now is thousands, if not millions of times as powerful as the supercomputers that we used to put a man on the moon in the late 1960s. And that then brings me on to the second part of this talk, which is AI and the future of work.
So that's the type of thing that we did with the Journal of Artificial Intelligence, with the funding from the Journal of Artificial Intelligence. So bear in mind, just so many political policymakers aren't familiar with these ideas. So in summary then, I think if we were to think through 3 core ideas in particular have worked well for us over the last decade or so in terms of introducing ideas related to emerging technologies into the political ecosystem. The first was these types of events which we did. Now, the events specifically on longevity, like here today, are terrific, and I love going to them. But additionally, events within the political ecosystem like this, we found to be very, very useful because you're just getting these ideas into the political discussions. But then additionally, when we did these events, as I mentioned, we did it without any corporate funding as well, which we found to be useful because you can then do it without any accusations of bias and so on. Then secondly, as well as the events, I think a book along the type that we're doing on AI at the moment could be very useful for radical longevity. So as I said, many of the books on longevity at the moment fall into one of 2 camps. The Amazon bestsellers and the books, the ones that are with the elite academic publishers, are often written by scientists for scientists. But the idea of getting the top experts in radical longevity around the world to each write chapters on all of these key areas, like we're doing with the AI book. So not just the science, but also the sociology, the economic aspects, so that really the idea is you have one book that any professor doing teaching or also policymakers can just read this one book and learn all of the key points in an afternoon or certainly in a weekend of reading a book. So we found that to be useful with the books we've done so far, and this AI book that's going to come out next year will hopefully have that type of impact for AI policy as well. But then the third method that we've used, let's say at the other end of things from the elite academic publishing, is also using things like animations, which again, bear in mind, many policymakers will not have time to read books on these different areas, whether it's radical longevity or AI. So to be able to get these points across relatively quickly and easily can be very valuable. And again, if it's possible to work with, let's say, some of the top journals, that also we found to be very useful as well. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope that's given some food for thought for the types of things that can help in getting these ideas into the political mainstream.